Okay, welcome everybody. Looks like we are live now. So welcome to tonight's Q&A with Melanie Saward for Toolkits. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that I live and work on Wurundjeri country and sometimes also on Boon Wurrung country. I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present, and I'd like to extend that respect to all First Nations people here today. Sovereignty has never been ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I think that's always an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about writing or talking about anything for that matter. And I know that there are people here from many different places, so I'd like to also invite you to share in the chat what country you're tuning in from tonight in the conversation box that we have here. So my name's Kate Blair, and I'm the fiction facilitator for Express Media's Toolkits program. In terms of introducing myself, I wrote a novel called The Modern that came out with Scrivener last September. I also write essays and occasionally short stories. But more excitingly, we have Melanie Saward here tonight for this Q&A. So Melanie Saward is a proud Bigambul and Wakka Wakka woman. She is a writer, editor, and university lecturer based in Tulmur, Queensland. Her debut novel, Burn, was published by Affirm Press in September 2023, and she's also had work published in the literary journals Griffith Review, Meanjin, Overland, Kill Your Darlings, and has fiction published in the anthologies Flock, First Nations Stories Then and Now, and New Australian Fiction. Her first romantic comedy novel, Love Unleashed, will be published by Penguin Random House in August 2024. So welcome, Mel. This is a delight to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, I'll just quickly run through some housekeeping details for everybody. For those who aren't aware, Toolkits Connect is a 12-week program for writers aged 30 and under to develop their skills in a unique and exciting online environment. And Toolkits is run by Express Media. Express has been around for about 30 years, developing, supporting, and promoting young writers through workshops that develop skills, through opportunities for constructive feedback and publication, and through awards and programs that recognise excellence. And Toolkits Connect is supported by Copyright, Cultural Fund, and Australian Poetry. This session is going to be available on YouTube as a resource, and it will also be captioned in the coming days. I'll also note that you can ask any questions that you want via the live chat on YouTube, and towards the end of the session, we'll include some of your questions on this. So we might get started now. I always think it's nice to kind of start with what we're reading at the moment. So Melanie, what are you reading right now?
I am reading from the big stack of books that I got while I was overseas when I was in Chicago a couple of months ago, and I visited a bunch of romance bookshops. And so I started reading one yesterday by a Black author called The Accidental Pinup, which is about a woman who runs like a pin-up photography boudoir studio, and she's shooting a major underwear campaign, and she ends up being the model for it and falling in love with the photographer. It's very silly and very good.
Oh, that's neat. It's also interesting that in the US you're able to go to romance specific bookshops. I feel like this continent needs some of those.
Yeah, we've got a couple, but we could do with more.
Yeah. So I also might start by asking about some sort of questions to contextualize you and your work before we move on to talking specifically about your work. So obviously we've run through the sort of official introductory bio, but I also want to ask how you see yourself as a writer and what your kind of path to writing has been. Like, how might you contextualize yourself as a writer?
It's a funny place to be right now with another book coming out in a different genre. So Burn was sort of more literary, and it straddles YA and adult fiction, and it's, you know, quite a serious book about Indigenous issues. And then I've got this sort of silly rom-com coming out, which, I mean, it does also deal with some serious issues in it, but in a more lighthearted way, coming out. So it's really strange because I've been around a lot of writers that are like, oh, I write literary fiction, I write kids lit, I write romantic comedy. And so defining myself, I've actually found is really difficult when people go, what do you write? And I'm like, oh, a bit of everything, actually. So yeah, I like, you know, as with when I put myself under a queer umbrella, I say queer. I don't talk about every label that I'm under. So I will say I am queer and I'm an author as well, because I think that it just covers all of those things, because I'm still writing a lot of nonfiction essays in my like free time. Romance is obviously a great love of mine, but I love literary fiction as well, and I'm still working on that. I've got kids books coming out next year. So like, how do I explain myself as a writer? I can't, I suppose. I can't, I need a broad label instead of a specific one.
I didn't know about the kids' books too. That's so exciting.
Yeah, they're middle grade books, and they're a co-write. So I'm co-writing them with Brooke Blurton, who some of you might know was the Bachelorette. She was the last Bachelorette a few years ago, the first First Nations and queer Bachelorette. And so we're writing some queer tween romance kind of books together, which are really cute, and they start coming out next year.
Oh, that's so cool. Now I might save these extra questions for so many more questions about this. Yeah, but I mean, part of why I thought you would be like a good choice for this Toolkits Q&A is because I find it really interesting that you've written in so many different areas. And so in terms of that kind of negotiation of those like different positions, is there kind of one central thing or one kind of starting point that you feel like motivates you as a writer, or something that you feel like you're writing from or writing toward that kind of connects those disparate strands?
I think that's a really great way of putting that question, though, because I think every time I look at everything that I'm writing, and it is it's to share something about what it is to be Aboriginal in this country, I think, and I'm really driven. Like, one of the things that I always, you know, if you ever hear me interviewed, and if people have heard me interviewed before, I'm really sorry to bring this one up again. I think I haven't talked about it for a while, but a few years ago, Melissa Lukashenko did a keynote at the First Nations Australia Writers Network conference or summit. I think it was just before COVID, I think. And it was published in Meanjin, and it was called Writing as a Sovereign Act. And I definitely recommend people look it up because it's freely available online. But it's sort of some of the things that Melissa talks about in that essay or that speech I find they underpin a lot of what I'm doing in every sort of approach to writing that I do. So she talks about storytelling and the breadth of our storytelling. So not just pulling on maybe that one narrative or pulling on stereotypes, but pulling on all of our narratives is really, really important. And that if the publishing industry and readers are now getting much more interested in reading and engaging with Indigenous stories, which is great, we kind of now need to show you that we are, you know, working across genres. We are passionate about different things. We're passionate about form, and that's, I guess, what underpins all the sorts of writing I'm doing. When I am working in nonfiction, I'm maybe being a little bit more experimental. So it's not everybody's cup of tea, but I feel like that's where I can get out of some more rigid forms. When I'm working in romance, it's funny. It feels like it's quite formulaic, which means I can achieve a lot in a very short amount of time because you have those beats that you need to hit. Whereas if I was writing something like Burn, I imagine that the next book that I write in that sort of vein is going to take a while to get right because of, you know, making sure sentence structures and those sorts of things is right is really important. But like at its essence, all of these things are telling you something about what it is to be Aboriginal and what our experiences are.
Oh, thanks. That's also something, it occurred to me as you were speaking, like I've sort of noticed that as well in like the other work you do, like for example, recently at Brisbane Writers Festival being First Nations curator, like the panels that you were working on were across, like there was a poetry one and there was another one about like romance novels that I would have loved to have seen. Like I wasn't there on that day, but I sort of saw all these pictures and thought, oh, I wish I could have gone to that.
Yeah, it was definitely about sharing the breadth of that, but also, you know, I put poetry on because while I straddle many forms, poetry is not one of them, and I love reading and like listening to poets read their work is one of the great pleasures of my life. I love listening to poets, and so it was kind of, you know, a little bit selfish of me. I wanted to sit there and listen to some of my favorite poets share their work, but also, yeah, it is again about the breadth of that storytelling and where people are working across the industry and highlighting things. Like I sometimes feel like I get a bit niche down and understand like writers in different pockets, and I think we all get a little bit like that. No, I'm in Ipswich in Queensland or Brisbane, so I kind of know who's writing and performing in the Brisbane scene, and you know, get to go out and see people, but maybe I'm not so great at what's going on in Nam, and so I love it when there are events that highlight that sort of thing in different states, so that when I then do travel, I get to, you know, go and engage with artists and poets in other places as well. So, you know, yeah, it was a very similar idea, but it also was a little bit selfish of me as well.
I mean, it's also sort of that idea of like gaining a sense of like what's happening in different places. It also kind of strikes me that there's maybe like an analogy there to like when you're writing fiction, or at least I find like when I'm writing like one type of fiction, if it's like literary fiction or whatever, like it's really helpful to read things which aren't literary fiction in terms of like you learn a lot from the kind of writing that you're not doing. In some ways that's kind of like traveling to different cities in terms of genres or styles.
Yeah.
So I might ask, sorry,
yeah, must have been a lag, but yes, I totally agree with that.
I might ask some questions now about Burn, which came out last year. I expect many people here have read Burn. I should note, Burn is amazing. I've just realized before this that I may have actually never told you this.
Oh, thank you.
So good. So I expect some people here have read it, but there might be some people who haven't. Plus, it's always kind of interesting to hear how a writer's summary of a book differs from a publisher's blurb or a reader's interpretation. So how would you describe Burn?
I should be getting really good at this by now. And I just did some pitching to like film people as part of like a practice film day, and I got really good at doing the pitch, but then every time I go to start it, I go, oh gosh, I've got to talk about my book. So Burn is about a young Aboriginal boy named Andrew who is pretty obsessed with lighting bushfires, and it looks at why there's a central question, which is one of the things I always talk about. It looks at why good kids do bad things, because when I say Andrew's an Indigenous boy who lights fires, I think often the first reaction is, well, why would a kid who we assume has been raised to care for country do something so dangerous and so destructive, not only to people but to country as well, and so this book is sort of an attempt to answer those questions, so when you first meet Andrew, he is in high school. He's sitting in a school assembly in a northern suburb of Brisbane, and there's cops on the stage, and the school principal is telling them that the behaviour is not going to be tolerated, and we're going to catch who lit the fire. And Andrew knows that he lit this terrible bushfire in their local area, but he's not worried about it. He's actually knows that the cops are going to come to him first because he's a little black kid. And he thinks that when they do come to him, his dad, who has been out of his life for over a year, will come back, because every other time he's lit a fire, his dad has come back to tell him off, basically. So, yes.
And I read that Byrne developed from an undergraduate creative writing assignment. And so I'm quite curious about that. Could you describe that process and sort of how it started, and kind of what the hardest part was in developing it?
Yeah, so for my final year of creative writing, I studied creative writing up here in Queensland at QT. And when I did it, the final year, final project was called Project 2, I think. Only 4 or 5 people took it, or 10 people took it. It was a very, very small workshop cohort, and it was worth 3 subjects worth of credit points. So we basically only took 2 subjects in that last semester, and you had to work on a big piece of writing across the whole semester and do critiquing. And most people, because we'd had a first project unit that had about 6,000 words, and then we did this second one, most people would start a novel and then either start another novel or continue that novel on. And I still have students now that do those projects that way. But now, when I was doing it, I wasn't sure I was ready to be a novelist. All of my ideas were these like short, contained things that, were like real character studies, which I think you sort of see in the opening of Byrne, which is where a lot of this short story was. It was these character studies, really like zoomed in, kind of claustrophobic, no extra information, just what that person could see, kind of short stories. But because I had to write 10,000 words and I didn't want to write a 10,000 word short story, I wrote a series of interconnected ones that were all centered around an event. It's become bushfires now, but in the original short story of Byrne, it was actually a bus crash, and the bus crash was the central event, which came about because I had sold my car to go to uni and used to catch this bus home, which was notorious for having kids throwing eggs at it when it hit this certain part of the road. And I was on the bus many nights coming home from uni and had eggs like cracking against the window, and I kept thinking, why would these kids do this? Like, they could cause an accident. The buses are going so fast on this street. We're in a suburb. It could kill people. Like, I was constantly asking why. And so that's what I did with this project, was I wrote about kids throwing a rock. So Andrew and his mates were the ones that had thrown a rock at a bus window. They caused a crash. I had another short story that was about someone that was on the bus. And then I had a third story that was about a relative of someone that was on the bus. So they were all sort of these tenuous connections that explored kind of the aftermath of that. And so what happened was, everyone told me in critiques that the short story that I wrote about Andrew and the boys was the best one out of all of them. And all the other ones, there was something about them that wasn't working. And I held on to it for a really long time because people were saying, don't do anything with this one. I got the story about the guy on the bus got published in our final year anthology, but I wouldn't publish Andrew's story because I knew it was the best one. And then after uni, that first year after uni, I had a few people read it to see how I could refine it. And all I was planning on doing with it was entering it into a competition, like one of the Overland ones that has big prize money, right? Because I didn't really know what I wanted to do in terms of writing a novel. I just thought that my next step was to win a short story prize. That's what I thought I had to do to get a career as an author. And everyone that I showed this short story to told me that there was a novel in it. And so that's when Burn came out. So I sat down and started really going into why would Andrew do this? Where does he come from? Why is he not worried about this rock that he's thrown at a bus window? And then as it refined on, I found this, he was lighting fires, and I was writing the earlier day scene. So in the novel now, it's got 2 timelines, one from when he was quite young and one when he's a teenager. And I was writing these flashback scenes of him as a kid, and he kept lighting fires and getting into trouble. And I was like, oh, it's the fires that are more interesting than the rock. Like, he can't just be throwing rocks at cars and buses. So that all came out. I think there's one scene in there now where Andrew talks about his dad throwing apples at cars off an overpass, but that is kind of all that's left of that original short story. So yeah, it took a long time for it to start to take this shape. It was only a couple of years after uni, but yeah, it was a little short story for a start. Yeah, and so if you get a hold of that old QT magazine from like 2009, you'll be able to read some of the other stuff that happened to people that were around when Andrew did things.
Wow, that's such a fascinating story. Also, there is a point in the book where they throw eggs at the bus too. So it's sort of...
yeah, that is one of the that scene was in the original short story. So it was cool to me that there were things that completely stayed and didn't change. So the short story always opened with the same opening scene that's in Burn now, with the principal looking down at them and the boys sweating in the school hall, and Andrew sort of being like, I don't care, like, they're going to look at me and say this. So even as it's gone through, 1 billion drafts and expanded from this, 2,000 word short story to an 80,000 word novel, there are elements in it that come from all those original parts, which is wild to me as someone who, did okay at uni, but I was never the high distinction student that the teachers were saying, yeah, you're going to be a writer and you're definitely going to get published. So yeah, it's wild to me how worthwhile it was keeping all of those pieces of writing from back then when I wasn't very good, let's be honest with you, but there was something in what I was doing. I just didn't have the craft to do it yet.
Wow, that's so neat and sort of lovely too, to kind of think that it's sort of, that kind of level of persistence and like continuing to work and think of something. I'm also like very attentive of time because I have so many things I want to ask and there's so little time. But I did want to ask one more question about Burn, which is maybe a tricky question to ask and maybe also a tricky question to answer, in that I don't want to give away the ending, but I also want to ask about the ending. Because like Burn as a book, I'd say like reading it does feel very real. But then in terms of that realism, like as a reader, you're sort of thinking, which ways can this go? And in the end, it kind of goes in a way that perhaps does diverge from expectations. I don't want to give away any. I want to be cryptic so people who haven't read it given away. But I found that ending really interesting, and so I was wondering how you feel about endings in your writing and how you kind of go about constructing and thinking about those.
Yeah, I love talking about endings, especially with Burn. And even if I've got to skate around the big spoilers, the driving force of the story, but the way I used to think about endings was I was not good at them. All of my endings were either the main character like died for some reason, or it faded to black at a critical moment. And it was because I went to university at a time where the literary novel was the king, right? And that was what we were reading. And I was loving reading these Australian fiction books. And now all the names have gone out of my head, but I really loved, maybe it was because of short stories as well, because I loved short stories, and you can't wrap a short story in a neat bow, is what I always thought. And so I would end them on these sort of obtuse endings where you couldn't tell whether the main character had died, or whether they were going to go to jail, or whether they were going to get caught for what they were doing, and it didn't wrap it up. And I thought, this is really fascinating. This is the ending that I'm fascinated with, because when the reader closes this book, they're going to go away, and that's what they're going to be thinking, what happened to this character? And I thought, that's what I want. I want them to like have a reading hangover where they can't stop thinking about my book. That was what I was trying to do. But it turns out that that's not actually a very good way of doing things all the time. Like, sometimes it does serve a good purpose, but it does leave people a bit unsatisfied. And also it doesn't, when you're trying to do what I'm saying at the start tonight, where I'm trying to, maybe break a stereotype or show you a different way of being Aboriginal, or make you really think about what's going on in our communities, is that to end it with a fade to black where you make inferences about what's going to happen, that does those characters a real disservice, doesn't it? Because it's not teaching anything, or it's not really making you challenge your the stereotypes that we all have them. We like to think that we don't, but we all understand what stereotypes are, because that's how we're raised, right? And so I decided that my ending, what actually happened with Burn was, my publisher said, we love the book, we're going to make a deal. The only thing that we're thinking is that we'd love it to be a tiny little bit more commercial, and that means, would you consider putting some hope in that ending? Because it absolutely did not have hope. And if people have read it later on, come talk to me about it, and I can tell you where it ends, but because people always want to know where it ended originally. And funnily enough, after shopping this novel for like 10 years, that was the question that I needed. Would you think about putting some hope in that end? And that was the question that I needed to fix the story for me, and also remind me that I'm writing fiction. It's quite realistic, as you say, it's realist fiction, but it's fiction, so I've got all the freedoms of fiction. So the story might be driving towards something, but because it's fiction, I have the freedom to imagine something that's not actually true, right? So that's I guess how I'm now sort of thinking about endings, is that there's a flexibility in fiction that you might not have in non-fiction, even when you're trying to write realism, and that's what I want people to get out of it. So I've talked to a lot of people who have picked up Burn, been really excited, and you've read it, so you know that quite a while it's quite low, a bit despairing. You cannot see what is going to happen. You feel for this kid. You probably feel for his parents too, like, even though his mother, I hope you feel for his mother. I know some people don't feel for her, but I hope you do. You feel for it, and you kind of take you into these depths of despair, but ultimately it has hope, and I really want people to get to that hope, because actually I don't think it's challenging if you don't get to that ending. So that's kind of how I've approached it here. I've probably approached it a bit differently in the new book because that's formulaic and it has to end on a happily ever after. But maybe I needed to channel a little bit more of those HEA vibes into the literary fiction to give people a bit of a challenge, I suppose.
That's a great answer. And I might also use that as an opportunity to segue to the new book, Love Unleashed. Mm-hmm. I'm very, very much looking forward to reading rom-com with dogs, The Dream. So I thought, as it's not out yet, I was wondering if you'd like to start by describing it briefly and maybe reading a little bit from the book.
Sure. So it's called, Love Unleashed. This is an arc of it. It's a bit shiny on the camera, but this is what it'll look like. It comes out on the 6th of August. And it was my PhD, actually. So I wrote this novel as my PhD, which is practice-led. And I guess what I set out to do as part of the PhD was to write a book that really highlighted what it is to be a young Aboriginal woman who was raised in the colony with dreams like everybody else has, but also with her beautiful family and her connection to culture as well. So this story is about Bryn. She's a Bigambul woman who has just finished her master's in editing, and her lifelong dream has been to go to New York and work on the Paris Review. She's obsessed with literary magazines, and she wants to go and bring Indigenous writing to literary magazines in New York. So she heads up. We meet her when she's heading off to New York to start looking for this job. She thinks she's going to get an internship with the Paris Review. She's got a 12-month visa, and she's quite optimistic, and she heads over to New York but can't get a job and misses out on the first round of internships and ends up taking the first job that she can get, which is working in a doggy daycare, which is very cute. And it's kind of, I guess, turning some rom-com tropes on its head. Some of the things that used to annoy me in romantic comedy when I was reading it, or chick lit back in the day, was that there were always skinny white girls. They'd get to New York and they'd have money. They'd have, parental backing or generational wealth or something that helped them out, that they would have somewhere to stay, like be doing a university program that gave them a dorm, or have a mate who had a spare room. So what I wanted to do was write about someone who goes and has a loving family but just doesn't have the financial backing. She doesn't go with the job. All she's got is the visa that says she's allowed to work, and she saved her money while she's been studying. So she's sort of got limited funds and limited contacts, and that's because I think that's what most of us who, I don't know about you, Anna, when you were in New York, but when I went to New York, that was me, right? My family would support me to the ends of the earth, but they just didn't have the money to do so. And I didn't have the contacts there, but I was convinced I was still going to do it because that was what TV and movies told me that I was going to do. So yeah, that's what Bryn does, but it, sort of turns some of those things on its head. And I wanted to show the lower socioeconomic side of living and working in New York. I wanted to show people living real lives and working really hard and all of those sorts of things, but it is still fun and it's still sexy and it's still a romance. So there's all of those things to it as well. And I might read a little bit. So I'm going to read, just for context, this is from the second chapter, and it's while she's at the airport with her stepdad and her younger brother. He's a half brother, and her mum, off the page of the book, has passed away recently from pancreatic cancer. So there's also that sort of element, a grief element to it as well. But this is in the airport as she's getting ready to go. Where are you travelling? She asks, looking at Chris, even though I'm the one standing at the counter with a passport and a printed flight centre itinerary. New York, I say. Well, LA first, but then on to New York. I hand over my passport. She glances between the three of us, and I bristle at the obvious difference in her attitude between the snooty girl before and us. Are you travelling alone, Miss Wallace? She says, looking down her nose at Maddie first and then Chris. Maddie is gripping the straps of his backpack and looking up at her, and I can see how he'd be mistaken for a traveller. Yes, just me. Well, I'm sorry, sir, but you'll have to wait over there. She points back to the end of the row. Only travellers in the queue. I can't see what the problem is. It's not like the line has passed customs, but Chris smiles, lifts my suitcase onto the scales and takes Maddie's hand. We'll go and order some breakfast. The attendant gets to work typing things into the computer and tagging the case before it disappears down the conveyor belt. Once it's gone, I think she's going to hand me my ticket and give me instructions for finding the gate, but she looks at the carry-on. I'll need to weigh it, she says, and the backpack. Oh, they're fine, I say, trying to straighten my shoulders underneath the backpack's weight. Definitely underweight, I lie. I'm sure they are, Miss Wallace, she says, though her pinched expression says otherwise, but I've got to check. I slide the backpack off and put it on the scale, feeling triumphant as it comes in underweight. And that one, she says, eyeing the small suitcase. It takes some effort to put it on the scale, and combined with the backpack, it comes in over cabin allowance. Shit. It's books, I say. I'm going to New York to be an editor. I need my books. There's a rumour that if you have a good excuse and act nice and needy, they'll let you pass. 5 extra kilos are nothing, especially not compared to all those bags that the other girl had before. We've got to get rid of 5 kilos worth, or they'll make you check the case and pay excess baggage at the gate, she says. Clearly, I'm not nice or needy enough for this one. I think back to the way she dismissed Chris and something twigs. Maybe it's less about being friendly and more about being too black. What? Now I'm supposed to I gesture at the ground and contemplate spilling out the contents of the case, which includes more than just books. There's at least a week's worth of clothes and toiletries in there too, because Nan had lectured me about lost bags and getting caught without spare undies. I don't fancy sorting out knickers from editing handbooks on the floor of Brisbane International Airport. No, you can do it wherever. You've just got to do it before you get on the plane. The newsagent has boxes and stamps if you want to post your books to your address in the US. Her nose wrinkles as though books is a dirty word. Or you could just put them in the bin and buy new ones over there. I was never going to win this one. I scoff. It's more likely that I'll ditch the undies in favour of the books, but 5 pairs of black Kmart brand pants won't even save one book, even if they are the giant high-waisted granny ones. I thank her and huff my way to the food court, where Chris has found us a table, and then ordered enormous mugs of coffee and a glass of juice for Maddie. Your breakfast is on its way, he says, gesturing at the plastic number at the centre of the table. I got you a big one since the food on the plane is going to be terrible. Thanks, I mutter, slumping into the chair. What's up, he asks, clocking my unusual lack of interest in the food. Oh, nothing, just that thanks to that cudgery at the counter, I've got to get rid of 5 kilos worth of stuff from my carry-on, or they won't let me on the plane. I say, maybe I should just give up and we could go back home. Chris is already out of his seat, crouching on the ground next to the red case. What did I tell you about giving up? He says, now what's in here? Far too many books if I know you. I bristle. There's not one book in there that I don't need. He holds one out. The Babysitter's Club, New York, New York? I snatch the battered softcover super special from his hands. It's practically a Lonely Planet guide, I say, thumbing the cover. No way am I moving to New York without it. The Australian Government Style Manual, he says, pulling the big manual out. Bryn, I know this is an editing book, but even dropped out of Year 12 me knows that you won't need this one in America. Plus, there's this magical thing called Google. You should try it sometime. He's right, of course, but I took my editing lecturer seriously when she told me that style manuals were akin to the Bible. I'd never given the actual Bible much credit, but this one's full of instructions and rules on how words should be used. Surely some should translate to American English. Don't diss the style manual until you've had to fight with your boss about whether a hyphen is equal to an M dash, I say, grabbing it off him and hugging it to my chest. But do you need this one? It's got to weigh at least. He snatches it off me and passes it back and forth between his hands. 1 kilo, maybe even 1.5. but it's full of annotations. Look, I tilt the book at him so he can see the post-its flagging pages that I've marked important things from my editing lectures. He keeps digging through my case, and I leap when I see at least 2 pairs of undies dislodged from where I've rolled them between books. Chris, do you think maybe it's not appropriate for a stepdad to search his adult daughter's stepdaughter's case? He ignores me. Bryn Wallace, if that dictionary is in here, it's not, I gloat, clambering to rescue my knickers from the airport floor. But I don't tell him that I did have a serious moment at 2 this morning where I considered packing the 2.5 kilo Oxford dictionary that Mum had bought me when I started uni. In the end, I let Chris remove the style manual, 2 novels, a bunch of old Overland magazines, and 3 hardcover notebooks. He stacks them in front of himself on the table and returns to his coffee as our breakfast arrives. What if I get through customs and the bag's still overweight? I ask through a mouthful of eggs and toast. Then you'll have to give him your Babysitter's Club books, he says with a grin. Book, singular. There's one. You saw it. Yes, I saw one. We didn't start going through your backpack. My mind goes straight to Stacey's Mistake and Welcome Back, Stacey, 2 more seminal Babysitter's Club books set in New York, which I hope are nestled safely between my laptop, folder of freshly printed resumes, and extra visa documents. She's got 2 in her backpack, Maddie chirps. I saw her pack them yesterday. Dobber, I say, shooting him a look. Am not. He pokes his tongue out. Just as I'm about to come under him for being cheeky, the enormity of what I'm about to do catches me and hits me and my breath catches. How am I supposed to get by without this cheeky bub taunting me every single day? He's 5 now, and when I get home in 18 months, he'll almost be 7. That's a lifetime in kid years. I sob and burst into tears. That's all I'll read today.
Thank you. Yes, I wish we didn't have to wait until August to read the rest of it. So
pre-order and you'll know it'll be in your mailbox when it comes out.
Very good advice. So we are a little tight on time, so I might ask if anyone in the chat has questions. And while we're waiting to see if any of those questions come through, I might ask a couple of other questions. Some of the things I was going to ask about genre, you've actually kind of already answered in conversation earlier anyway. But one question I did want to ask in relation to that is how kind of thinking about the readers like changes when you're writing something like a romantic comedy to writing like literary fiction, like whether, because often the readers of romance or romantic comedy have very sort of specific things expected and constraints.
Writing for romance readers is way scarier than writing for literary audiences, to be honest for you, because we like have expectations, and like I see it in myself, you know, I'll pick up a book and go, they called this a romance, this is not a romance, it doesn't have a happily ever after, a happy for right now is not a happily, and I will do all of that sort of stuff. And so I'm utterly terrified because I'm also playing with those sorts of things, but writing for the audience is really important for me because romance readers are the best kind of people. I go to this amazing book club which started in an independent bookstore that closed down, that we loved each other so much that we've kept it going, and we now meet in a library. And one of the very first ones that I went to, and I went for research just to hear what readers were saying. I didn't sort of expect to like fall in love with these people, but they were getting so mad at fade to black scenes, and every love scene in Love Unleashed originally was pretty much a fade to black. And these people that like my book club are the audience, right? They're my dream audience. I want them to, if I wasn't in the room, say that they love this book. So I went away and I was like, okay, the spicy scenes need to be actually spicy. And that was done for them, with them in mind. And mostly because I think that there is such a good subsection of what those romance readers are. But yeah, we're a pretty passionate bunch, romance people, especially on the academic side as well. You know, that I went to this conference in Chicago a couple of months ago, and you know, it's that at the level of analysis that goes into if this is a happily ever after and if this is the right sort of third act breakup and so on. It does make me a bit nervous. And this is sort of non-traditional in terms of it borrows a lot from the old chick lit from the early 2000s, meaning that it might not be immediately clear who the actual love interest of the story is going to be. Whereas, you know, a lot of the romance we see now is dual perspective. So you already know who the central couple is when you start reading it. But I needed a little bit of like guessing in there.
I'm always like very sort of impressed and intimidated by romance audiences.
They're the best and the scariest.
So I'm not sure if we have any questions in the chat yet, but that's lucky for me because I haven't asked a very important question that I think I actually noted in the blurb for this that we would talk about. So this question is, what role do dogs play in your writing process?
They played a huge role in my writing process. My little Westie Archie, he was with me while I wrote most of this book. It's sad that he passed away last year, so he's not here and won't be here for the launch of this book, but he plays a big part in it. Him and his uncle, my parents' dog Jack, was also a Westie. So there are two Westies with starring roles in this book, and it's kind of, you know, I fought to get Westies on the cover because they're actually in the book. They're named in the book. There's a Dalmatian called Perdita in the book as well. So the dogs on the cover are very important, but like dogs are just a huge part of my life. Like 5 minutes before this thing started, my neighbor came up to say hello, and her dogs just ran straight in my house because they hang out at my house all the time, and they had to come in and rescue them off the couch because they're a huge part of my life, like having them at my feet or having someone to cuddle or even take for a walk when you're having a bit of writer's block. I just really loved having a dog around. So I'm very sad that Archie's not here, but the book is dedicated to him and to Jack as well. And every time I look at the acknowledgement, it makes me cry because it says that this is a book that started with the dogs, and so my acknowledgements start with dogs. And so I talk a bit about all the dogs and also all the people that were important in mine and Archie's life while I was writing the book as well. So I talk about his daycare that he went to, which was not like the daycare that I worked at. So yeah, and hopefully stay tuned if you're in Brisbane, but hopefully we'll be doing a puppy party as part of the launch at his daycare or with some of his daycare friends. Yeah, we're having a chat about that now. So fingers crossed. And I want to try and do some dog-friendly locations anyway. The Brisbane launch will be at Avid Reader, which is dog-friendly. So, you know, bring your doggies along for me to cuddle. That'll make me very happy. So, yeah, they're extremely essential to my writing.
That's wonderful. It makes me want to move to Brisbane so I can come with this dog. Yeah. I met a great greyhound at Avid Reader when I was in Brisbane.
Yeah, there's always great dogs at Avid. There's always great dogs. I'm sort of hoping I might, fingers crossed, have a little friend by then to take along with me. But in the rescue, I'm rescuing, so in the rescue world, it doesn't always go according to plan. But yes, hopefully. So stay tuned. I guess get on my social media if you want to see if I introduce a new friend into my life.
Exciting. So I don't think we've had any questions come through in the chat unless they aren't showing up on the live stream. But we are about out of time anyway. So thank you, Mel. This has been such a delightful conversation. I have loved this opportunity to ask you questions. For Toolkits participants, just a reminder that we are also gathering in the Google Meet, so you can ask questions directly. And also a reminder to everybody that the session will be available on YouTube in the coming days, and it will be captioned if you want to revisit this conversation. If you've enjoyed this, it's also worth checking out the archive of previous Toolkit sessions. There are a lot of really great ones up there that you can watch. So much to learn just by watching YouTube, which is great. Thank you so much once again, Melanie. Everybody, I would encourage you, if you haven't already read Burn, to read Burn and also pre-order Love Unleashed so that it arrives in your mailbox as soon as it's possible to arrive in the mailbox.
Yeah.
Have a lovely evening, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.